Hi, my name is Andrew Tsai, and I'm a Strategic Engagement Manager and work in the Akamai Professional Services Group. The title of this presentation is Code Once, Deploy Everywhere, and this was the same track that was given at Akamai Edge World 2019 in Las Vegas. This demo will show how to take an existing property manager configuration and be able to work with it as code and integrate with any DevOps workflow, such as automated builds, testing, releases, hooks into other developer productivity tools. This demo will use Git, our Akamai CLIs, and Jenkins, and show how a single code change or a single commit could trigger workflows that will create property manager versions and keep multiple environments in sync automatically. Before we dive in the demo, I'd like to first give a glimpse into how currently configurations are managed at Akamai. Typically, there are multiple environments on our platform. So there may be a dev, a QA, a prod, staging, preview, etc., as well as new ones on demand that need to spin up to support cross-functional teams or different features. These configurations have largely been their own separate configurations that are on staging and production independently. When you look at an existing configuration, the rules typically or features enabled are largely the same, such as the feature to enable H2 or configure a caching rule. However, there are largely things that need to be slightly different across different environments. So things like origin hostname, CP code, cloudlet policy, these things need to be kept separate or different across multiple environments while still inheriting or allowing flexibility across the common rule base. There's also the challenges of knowing exactly what's been deployed where, including what features, and how these things are all kept in sync. There are visual comparisons that folks do with the UI. However, this process has largely been manual. And from an API perspective, managing this as one monolithic JSON or XM file has also been challenging. As mentioned previously, there's often the need to spin up a brand new environment that should inherit the same settings as existing dev, QA, or stage environment. Finally, there's the goal of making Akamai work the same way as we could work with your existing code and use your existing workflows or productivity tools. So this demo will help to show how this can be accomplished as well. So with that, I'd like to get in the demo. Here are a couple commands that I'll be using throughout this. At a high level, the first one is creating a pipeline. This will actually take your existing property manager config and create the JSON snippets that could be checked into repository along with support for multiple environments. The merge process is one that will take the templates files and the variables, stitch them together, almost like a compile or a build step. That could produce an artifact that can then be consumed by our PAPI endpoints or other workflows as well. When we get into creating a new environment to fit into this pipeline, there'll be a clone property command as well, and often what's needed as well is the ability to create new CP codes and things like that. Finally, there'll be a GitHub repo where the same demo is stored, so you can feel free to download it and use it as a starter or follow along with some of the commands there. So with that, I will go into Luna. And show you a sample configuration and a sample demo website. So for the purpose of this demo, we will be using a dev config as code astronaut training website that has multiple environments on Akamai. As you can see, there's a dev, a prod, a stage, and we'll show you how we can keep these in sync as well as to find a new one as well. If I were to take a closer look at the dev config, you can see here that we have a default rule that should look familiar. We have an origin that's defined, a CP code that's defined. We have performance rules. We have offload rules, which are our various caching rules with various TTLs. We have an enable delete method, as well as some CORS settings to set the CORS headers if they match the origin whitelist. So as mentioned, the first step is creating the pipeline. So I won't actually run this step because I've already done it, but essentially the command will look something like a new pipeline command. So this will take the source property and create a dev, stage, or prod properties. If these already exist, then you can also point it to those, or use these as temporary standby ones to play with until you're ready to cover to the actual real configurations that you already have. So when you run this command, what will happen is it'll create a file structure that looks something like this. You will have a templates file, which I'll show you here in a second, an environments file that has the environments that you've set up, and some variables files and project definition files as well. So deep diving on these actual files themselves. So the main rule is the equivalent of the default rule. And you'll see that we have the same child includes of rules that you would find in Luna. So if I go back to the Luna property, again I have a default rule, performance, offload, enable, delete, and CORS. Here as well in the editor, you would have the same rules included that match. If I were to dive into one of these particular rules themselves, such as enable, delete, you can see that it is the JSON representation of just that rule. Similarly for offload, similarly for performance, and then also for the CORS rule. So with this structure, you can define new subrules or re-architect your configuration as you see fit. Where this starts to become applicable across multiple environments is defining variables or environments for each environment. So the way that is managed is through the environments folder. So you can define any number of environment folders. So in this case, we have dev, prod, and stage. We have a master variables definition file. So this does include PM variables as well. Or if there are things that Property Manager doesn't support as variables, such as a PM variable, such as a CP code, or pinning of certs, or things like that, this can also be modified to account for those as well. So in this particular example, I've defined an origin default variable, a CP code default variable, a CORS. This is actually going to be an array, right here, of whitelist domains. And for my dev, we have defined what those settings should be. So in this case, we're using 852.416, but in the prod, we would be using a different CP code, similarly for origin and CP and CORS whitelist domains as well. So once you have these variables defined, you can then use this variable notation to show or serve as placeholders for those environment-specific settings. So in this particular case, I've defined an origin variable as well as a CP code variable, and then in my CORS list as well, if I search for $env, you can see that this is where the array of CORS whitelist domains will be substituted as well. So once you have these defined, you can run a merge process. So this is so here's my environments folder that again I want to do, let's say, a build of dev or a merge. So let me go up one directory and run on, this is our Akamai pipeline CLI. So I want a merge, and the actual pipeline name in this case is astronaut training, and I want to build a dev build, if you will. So you'll see that when I ran that created a dev property.json where the actual values have been substituted with what I've defined in the environments variables.json file. Similarly, if I were to run this for another environment, such as stage, and then while I'm at it, prod, you can see that these changes will also account for the different settings as defined in the environment's variables.json file. So with that, I can now check in changes into a repository. So the repository, again, is a mirror of what I have locally. So here is a sample repository that I've defined in here in Bitbucket. You can see that the templates files are managed here as well, and then the appropriate environments settings accordingly. So now I'm going to illustrate how we can make an actual change. So for this particular change, let's actually go into the template rules here, and let's find some file extensions, and let's say I don't want exes to be cached, and I want to make PDFs cached. And to illustrate another change, instead of 1 day, let's make this 12 hours. So if I do a get status, it'll tell me that my template's offload change file has been changed. So if I want to do a quick diff of that rule, excuse me, there is the change that I just made locally. So I'm happy with that change. I want to add that change to the repository. Change TTL and file extensions exe and PDF. And so I push that change to the repository, which will then show up as I would expect. And you can see that the offload.json is the only file that changed, and I went from 1 day to 12 hour, and also changed an exe file and PDF as illustrated. Then you can go into some place like Jenkins here. So if you go back here, I've set up a couple jobs here. I've set up a job for our dev environment, our stage environment, and our prod. If I look through the steps of what this does, it's going to first sync with the repo. It's going to do the merge. So this is the same command that I ran locally to verify that the local find and replace for the various environments work properly, to create the artifact. Once it created that artifact, it's actually going to update. This is using our Akamai CLI property to update the actual property name with that file that got created from the dist folder, right? So just like in my local, when I ran the merge locally, it created these output here. On this Jenkins server, it's taking that same build process or merge process and using that same artifact, and then it's also going to update, the build notes here, so I can actually notate in Luna which build or which commit created that version. We can then activate that property to staging. Here we wrote a little thing that we'll call Akamai Test Center. I'll get to this or demo this at the end. And then if those tests pass, we want to actually create those and push those changes to Akamai production. So with that being said, I can actually run this job. And I can watch it. And while I'm waiting, while this is kicking off, let's say I actually want to also do the same change in stage. So stage is the same build steps. It does the merge. The only difference now is it's stage, and then it's updating the stage property, and then it's activating this one to staging. So while that's going, I'll actually trigger a build here as well. And obviously you can do the same thing for prod as well. So I'm going to go back to staging. And you can see it already in the merge, and now it's activating this to staging. if I wanted to go back into this configuration, let's see if this is actually finished. It has. So I can look at version 17. And my offload rules, 2TL, should now be 12 hours. And my file extension list is now missing exe and has PDF. So this worked properly. Let me show you also how we could add a new rule. So let's say we wanted to add a rule to support the strict transport header. So I could define a rule here called #include hsts.json. And in my templates, let's add a new file. Let's call it hsts.json. And then in this rule, let's actually include a rule here. So this is deleting the outgoing response header and then adding a new one for strict transport header. You may be asking yourself, well, how did you get this JSON? There is a way you can actually code the change in Luna, and then there's an actual view rule JSON button. So let's say I want to actually configure this rule. I could hit this, and then this could be what I check in. Or we have some new JSON snippet generators in the pipeline that you could choose your own product, whether it's actually the strict transfer rule entirely, looks like that's been added as behavior, or the old way that I was doing it with modify outgoing response header, change a couple settings here, and then essentially take this JSON and check it in as well. So with that being said, I've added an HSTS rule. If I want to check this locally again before I merged it, or committed this change, excuse me, I could also run the same merge command. And then in my actual dev, I should see the HSTS rule, which looks good. So that's an example of how a single change could be checked in and how these template files can be managed as snippets, and essentially now be checked in and managed like code like everything else, while still maintaining support for things that need to change per environment. In this case, it was CP codes, origin, and a CORS whitelist domain. So let's check in this change before I forget about it. So I want to add the templates.main file, and I want to add the templates HSTS rule and add support for HSTS rule. Okay. So now we'd like to actually clone a configuration or add a new environment. So how do we do that? So while I went over the environments and the templates files, there's actually a project info file. This is actually a streamlined version of what the initial pipeline command created. I simplified it to really only count for environments and name, and I'm using Akamai CLI property to actually be the one that is a little bit more flexible and just takes the raw rules.json and updates the specific property versus the Akamai pipeline commands. So this is why I was able to simplify a lot of the steps that you'll see here. So in here, let's say we have a dev, a stage, and a prod. Let's add a preview. So this project info.json file defines the list. It expects the same number of folders in the environments file. So I want to essentially clone this dev folder, and let's call it preview, to match what's defined in project info.json. Let's go into here. This as well is this preview. You could ignore these environment hash, rule hash for now. What this has done, anytime you run a local merge, it actually generates that. So that's not something that I would really check in or need to track. And then my variables file, this is where I want to changed my preview type setting. So instead of API-dev, it should be preview. Let's change this as preview. I'm going to actually keep the origin the same because I actually don't have a preview origin. And then for CP code, let's actually create a new one. So the way to create a CP code, you can use our APIs as well. So I actually have this command already cheat sheeted here. So let's create a new command. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So this is going to create a post to the PAPC one. This is the contract that I want, as well as the group. And then it does take the input JSON as the body. In this case, it looks something like this. So preview config astronaut training. Let's just give it a name like 2. And let's run this. So I can use this CP code as my new setting for preview. Okay. So again, if I wanted to essentially run a local merge just to make sure that I've done this properly, I don't need this terminal anymore. We'll go one command back, and let's run a merge of preview. So here's my preview, and then my CP code has been changed to 828. This description and things like that will actually be ignored. It just took it from the latest template. If I want to check some other preview settings, such as API mobile, you can see things have been substituted there as well. So I'm happy with this change. So let's add my project info change. Let's add my environments preview star. So that's everything that's defined for that environment. And that should be good. So add preview environment. So I have the preview changes committed into the repo, and you can see that it matches my local repository. So here's my preview environment with my preview settings. So I'm going to actually now clone a, let's say the prod config, or really any config. I need a placeholder. I could either go into here as well and create a brand new one. So I don't have a preview config here. I could clone one of these. I'm actually going to run a Akamai property clone command as well to do this. So the way that can be done is through something that looks like this. So I'm going to take the existing dev, and I'm going to clone So this created a preview configuration. So if I were to check this, I don't really care the rules that are in there because I'm going to use my Jenkins job to actually populate them from the repo that I just checked in around the HSTS. So if I were to go back into my repo here, I have my HSTS rule, I have the preview environment that I just checked in. For the interest of time, I actually already created a preview job. The preview job again though is basically the same as what I defined for dev, stage, and prod. The only difference now is it's been the preview environment that I'm building, and I want to update the preview config as code config, and I don't really care about activating this to staging or production. This will just show that that I've created the merge properly in the actual property manager version. So now that that's there, let's run this job for preview. So it looks like it's been successful. If I were to go back into the preview, config as code, configuration, I should see that the CP code has been updated. I can see my new HSTS role that had been checked in. And I can also see the settings are exactly the same as I'd done in production, and my cores list uses the proper preview origin whitelist. And then again, just like all the versions that have been created through Property Manager, you can see that the commit is tied to the actual commit that I see here as well. So that you can always tell which Property Manager version got created from where. So with that, I believe I've shown how to essentially, sync multiple changes through code and use those workflow, in this case Jenkins, to create multiple Property Manager versions and activation steps, how to build a new environment from scratch. Obviously, these steps are quite flexible, so if you want to include your own testing, you're more than welcome to include your own testing scripts or various things on your end. We do have a Test Center API, that's Akamai Test Center, of where you can be used to compare an HTTP request response from one version to another. I know some changes are being planned there to allow for more visibility in terms of certain features that can be verified in the Akamai platform. But testing or whatever defined workflow process is certainly part of this as well. So with that, hopefully you've enjoyed this demo. If you have any questions, feel free to contact your local Akamai representative or check out developer.akamai.com. Again, here was the repo that we used. That's a copy of what I've just done. It's on github.com/akamaicontrib. Code wants to deploy everywhere. You can see here's where we ran the new pipeline command. Here's where we did the merge. And then the Jenkins steps really just used Akamai CLIs to do the merge, update a configuration, and activate it. And then any future steps or other things like that can be obviously added at your leisure. Thank you for the time. Again, contact your Akamai representative if you have any questions. Thank you.